I'm saying, why don't we use what we have that we haven't touched in over 50 years as collateral for a new Treasury debt instrument, which I think would grab attention and start to make citizens focus on what were the advantages of these prior monetary systems linked to gold.
Welcome, everyone. This is David Morgan of morganreport.com. And the word special is overused, but this is a special moment for yours truly. Dr. Judy Shelton wrote a book, Good as Gold. I read it. I listened to a few of her interviews, but she actually was, I think if I'm saying this right, Judy, correct me, but a nominee to go on the board of directors at the Fed. And the book starts out with you sitting in this dark paneled room. I could kind of picture it the way you said it and, what you went through and just sitting there quietly and, listening to what was going on. Then you had your chance to say your piece. And I think you hit a home run there. So just let's start out on the moral side. I mean, I'm on your side with this. What is the moral argument for having a sound money system?
Well, almost biblical. I think you're not supposed to have a lightweight and a heavyweight, and that may be from Deuteronomy. But the idea that you're not supposed to, when you're buying something, you would use a lightweight to sort of figure out what you owed for, say, I don't know, a few ounces of grain, and then a heavyweight when you were getting paid. And you don't want to manipulate the rate of exchange to cheat your fellow man. And so a false balance, I think it says in the Bible, is not good. And that's sometimes interpreted exactly with the word you said, honest measures. We're supposed to have honest measures because carrying out trade with each other as humans, it's really an act of commerce and voluntary. And you need to trust who you're dealing with, and you have to both agree on the medium of exchange. And so it has to be an honest measure to protect both sides of that transaction. And I think it's just a basically fundamentally moral approach to carrying out transactions in the context of the money you use because it's legal tender. That to me then compels the government to make it be sound money, to perform as a meaningful unit of account and a store of value, because you have to use it. And so I think you deserve to have sound money in a moral sense, since your government provides it.
You instantly reminded me, I have to ask you all the books behind you. Do you have the book Money, You Shall Have Honest Weights and Measures by James Ewert?
Yes, I do.
Okay, yeah, that's exactly, and he goes through that whole idea and he uses the legal definitions of what a note is and all that. And of course, being a PhD, all that. So
or Steve Forbes always talks about money as a measure. And why would you have a ruler that's 11 inches for some people and 9 inches for others? You absolutely have to have a common, unvarying standard and as a unit of measurement.
And I know what you've proposed or maybe advocated in the book about going to a gold-backed bond, perhaps 30 or 50 years. But on a bigger challenge, what do you believe would be the biggest challenge of implementing a modern gold standard? What would we have to overcome to get, let's say, the political class into our camp?
Well, I go back to historical systems to just talk about how nice it is, actually, if the money works for everyone the same way. And so you have to define what you mean by a gold standard. And under a classical international gold standard, you as an individual, if you thought that things were getting frothy in the economy, you had the right to convert. You could convert into gold. Under Bretton Woods, if you thought the U.S., who was the anchor country and the only country that had to have a fixed rate of exchange between the dollar and gold, if you thought the U.S. was exporting inflation and you were a foreign central bank, you had the right to convert. As far as a modern gold standard, I'm not advocating either of those per se. I'm saying there should be some kind of gold backing for the dollar. I propose what I think is a pretty pragmatic initiative, something we actually could do. I'm not such a dreamer that I think you could go on what some people think of as a gold standard, who they tend to think, well, you turn in paper money and you get gold. Well, those days are long gone. Right now, the Federal Reserve notes outstanding, just the cash, the paper US dollars in cash, I think it's about 2.5 trillion, roughly. And about 70% of that circulates outside the United States. We don't know how it's being used or for what purposes. So I'm not suggesting that we would say all of those Federal Reserve notes, those paper dollars, should be convertible into our holdings of gold. They're worth about 700 billion. I don't want to wipe them out. Instead, I'm saying, why don't we use what we have that we haven't touched in over 50 years as collateral for a new Treasury debt instrument, which I think would grab attention and start to make citizens focus on what were the advantages of these prior monetary systems linked to gold. One thing, that the money was sound, in the sense you had a claim to gold, something with intrinsic value that you could exercise at your own volition under the first one, the classical. And I think under Bretton Woods, you had something very important if we are to preserve the principles and the logic of international trade, and that's a level international monetary playing field. So I want to recapture some of those virtues in something new, but I'm proposing a pragmatic initiative that's actually doable as a way to move us toward potentially a broader system. And I mean, if people like having Treasury instruments convertible into gold, and they start valuing, say, what you might call a solid US dollar, maybe you issue stable coins against these gold convertible Treasury trust bonds, maybe that you ask your trade partners to do something comparable. I mean, it could evolve into something larger, but I want to start out being successful in just this one small endeavor, because I think we could pull it off.
So I've, been at this a while, and I've, studied monetary history, and I'm not a know-it-all, I'm a learn-it-all, and there's a lot of things I don't know. But I ran across a paper years ago on Gold Eagle. It was one of the first websites dealing with gold and all subjects thereabouts. And there was a paper written that was called Gold Standard Equals Fiat in Disguise. And I'm just going to read you a paragraph out of this, and I want your take on it. His name is J.N. Taglia. It was written in 2002. And he says, we can have an honest money regime when gold is priced in silver and silver is priced in gold, physical silver and physical gold. But once gold is priced in printed pieces of paper instead of pieces of silver, the honest money regime is gone. Even though the formerly silver and now fiat units of account are defined in a weight of gold, because there is no natural limit to the overall amount of printed pieces of paper as there are when there's an overall amount of pieces of silver. And I'm going to go on from there and just add one more thing to you, Judy. But, there's been an argument made that Frank Baum, when he wrote The Wizard of Oz, was really a metaphor for going from the bimetallic standard to the monometallic standard, the Eastern establishment with the yellow brick road. And as you well know, the slippers that Judy wore were silver slippers, and all she had to do is click her heels and go back home, which was a metaphor. The way I see it is going back to, bimetallism. Bimetallism. I gave you a lot there, but I just couldn't wait to ask you this question. I know you haven't been asked this one before.
Bimetallism is very appealing. I mean, it was the system that the founders had in mind when in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution and Section 10, only gold and silver were allowed to be used by the states. And Congress was empowered to regulate the value of our money. But when it was determined later, after Thomas Jefferson wrote his notes on the establishment of a money unit in 1784, he said, if we decide the dollar is our money unit, we must say with precision what a dollar is. And by 1792, the Currency Act, they had decided that the dollar would be 25 grains of gold or 371 grains of silver. Milton Friedman, whose office at the Hoover Institution was just down the hall, not so far away, he has his book, Money Mischief. And he has an excellent chapter on bimetallism. And I believe he said he thought that was one of the more successful systems. I've also brought it up when the great Robert Mundell was living. He was a fantastic colleague for decades. And I once asked him about bimetallism, and he likewise very much favored it. When I look at this initiative, that my Treasury trust bond idea, which I hope we could proceed to implement, I think we could, it's because we still have the residual gold holdings from the Bretton Woods era. So we already have those 261 million ounces. As far as silver, I don't think we have any similar holdings, except very minor amounts at the U.S. Mint, perhaps. But I might say that at the time that the Bretton Woods system was being worked out, en route to Bretton Woods, there were a number of people trying to figure out what the actual architecture would turn out to be, who were favoring silver. And I think both China and Mexico favored a silver standard or a bimetallic approach. And in the Republican platform in both 2012 and 2016, I believe they talk about a metallic, they don't say a gold convertible dollar, they talk about having some kind of metallic standard that would provide backing to the dollar. So I definitely think if you could establish a dollar linked to both silver and gold, it would be positive. I don't know if we have the hoards of silver, but there's nothing to prevent government from purchasing silver either.
Right. I'm going to be at the New Orleans conference, the Gold Conference, the 50-year anniversary, and Milton Friedman spoke there, and at his lead in, he said that silver is the monetary metal of history, not gold.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. No, that wouldn't surprise me at all. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is one I really put a lot of thought into, and you've talked a lot about, zero inflation, and then you use the 2% figure quite often. And I'm with you. I mean, I have very little pushback on you, but I'm a fairly good thinker, or at least I think I am. And this is what bothers me about what we never taught in finance. So as a thought experiment, if you took a penny at the time of Christ and compounded at a nominal 2% per year, that penny would be worth 2.2 times 10 to the 17th, or nearly 2.2 trillion. Now, I know 1,000 trillion is a quadrillion, but I don't know what a trillion is. I don't know if it'd take me a half an hour to put that many zeros on it. Naturally, this is more than all the money on the planet by several orders of magnitude. And if you do the arithmetic, and I haven't, but I'll take this guy at his word, it's 6 planet Earths. So the idea is that you cannot compound indefinitely. And I've thought about this a great deal before our interview, and I'm not saying I'm right or wrong, it's just my thought, but it made me reconsider, because I got a math background, and then I went to, get my degree in finance, but we never really teach this in finance. You don't think about it going on. And in the Bible, we have this Jubilee every 50 years. And it seems to me like that makes sense, because you could compound for 50 years and not get to the exponential function where it just takes off to where it's unmanageable. So I just want to throw that out there and get some comments from you.
I think Warren Buffett talks about the miracle of compounding, compound interest. So that's interesting. There was a discussion at the Federal Reserve on that 2% target versus a 0% target if you're defining stable prices. In July 1996, Greenspan was presiding over the big mahogany table at the Federal Reserve headquarters. Janet Yellen was a governor. Jerry Jordan was the head of the Cleveland, I think, District Federal Reserve Bank, and they were having a discussion of what does it mean, stable prices. Actually, the legislation from 77 and 78, the Federal Reserve Reform Act, and then the Humphrey Hawkins legislation, anticipated, that is, it directed the Federal Reserve to achieve 0% inflation by 88. So it's not so controversial. I think it's sort of a sleight of hand that the Fed has interpreted stable prices to mean stable inflation. But that 2% target was discussed at that meeting where you can read the transcripts on the Federal Reserve website from July 96. And Jerry Jordan said, if you asked people, would you rather have a dollar be worth 5 cents or 13 cents in 100 years using compounded rate for 2% versus 3% inflation, which would you choose? And he said, I think most people would say, well, why should it be worth anything less than $1? Why shouldn't a dollar be worth $1? All you have to do is have 0 instead of 2 or 3, and the dollar would be worth 100 cents. And he said, I just don't see any benefit from deliberately debasing the dollar. And I recall in Paul Volcker's final book, Keeping at It, The Quest for Sound Money and Good Government, he said he never accepted from either a moral point of view or an economic point of view the logic of, he said, even low inflation. He said it's still skimming. It's still taking away purchasing power. And I love, he said in the book, my mother would see through that. He meant it's just such an obvious scam that he was amazed that that was becoming a conventional thinking at central banks.
Well, let's explore that a little bit more. I mean, if, stealing a little at a time, that's acceptable instead of stealing a lot at a time. So let's look at 0%. I mean, I wrote about this in the Silver Manifesto. And what happens, as you well know, is that you get a gentle deflation. So if I start in the workforce at 20 years of age and I feel I'm going to work 20 years or 40 years and I'm going to retire at 60, I know that every dollar I have saved is going to buy me the same, or actually a little bit more, due to productivity increases, technology, people find better ways of doing things, we become more efficient, all the things we know about being, students of economics. So I wouldn't need a financial planner. I wouldn't need, to get into a mutual fund that guarantees me I'm going to get 2% more than the inflation rate. And we know the inflation rate's this, and there's so many inflation rates. I mean, it's my friend Mike Maloney calls a CP lie, because you take out food and energy, because, what human needs food or energy, for crying out loud, right? So, so I really like that idea, but that kind of begs the next question, which is usury. I mean, can we run a system without usury? I mean, we went from 2009 to 2019 with a zero interest rate policy, and actually went to negative interest rates, which that wasn't in my book in finance. And what are your thoughts on that?
On usury?
Yeah.
I mean, I think I believe in the time value of money. Everyone has a decision to make at any given moment of whether to save or consume. And I think that if you choose to save, you're really saying, I will provide this seed corn. I will give you money that I could use to eat, drink, and be merry right now in this moment. But I have faith in the future, and I will make this money available for you to carry out your project, which makes sense to me. I trust you, and I think that we will reap a greater harvest together because I'm willing to sacrifice in order for you to harvest your project, and we'll all benefit. That attitude, which I think is a real virtue, we're getting kind of religious in this conversation, but it is a virtue of capitalism, that faith in the future, and a willingness to sacrifice immediate consumption for the sake of raising standards of living for the future, maybe generations in the future. I mean, what you want is long-term investment. Those are the projects that elevate the standard of living for whole nations. So I believe in that, and I wouldn't begrudge someone who gets compensated for doing that. I mean, if they want to do it out of the goodness of their heart, then it's really a gift or a grant. But I think it's still an act of faith to say, I'll invest in what you're doing, because if you should be paid some amount of interest, because there's risk. We might not have tomorrow. And you could have had eat, drink, and be merry. That could have been the smarter way to go, because it's all going to disappear. But I think that there should be compensation because you're doing something truly risky, but for a greater good. And so I think it's natural to have the time value of money. That's banking grew out of that. Robert Mundell, who I always mention, really my mentor, he ended up having an international monetary conference every year at a castle he purchased just outside Siena, Italy, with his Nobel Prize money. And in Siena, you have the original banks. I mean, you have medieval banks, some still in operation. And he loves to tell the story of how the time it would take to deliver money from one Italian region to another really determined interest rates, and how that then sort of set up the structure of money in my hand today versus a 4-day horseback ride where I could get robbed. So what is that money worth, a claim to that money? And it's fascinating. But bottom line, usury is not imposed. I think two parties go into an agreement and they agree on an interest rate. I never see the bank as a greedy predator. I always think, you're infantilizing the borrower. I think two thinking adults can make an agreement. You lend me money and I'll pay you back. And there's a cost to it, but I'm willing to do that. It's worth it to me, and I'll make enough to more than justify it, what I have to pay you. So I have no problem with that. As far as Jubilee, that's an interesting one. We do see that debt can be issued in amounts that then become extremely depressing to imagine paying off. On the other hand, there are references in the Old Testament to when they had such arrangements. Then as you got close to when they would have to renegotiate and go back to the beginning, then you had to work out quantitatively what land was worth, and it almost complicated things, the Jubilee, because who wants to be left holding the bag when suddenly all obligations are, you're free and clear? I don't think that can work. I mean, that's really declaring bankruptcy, and that can be quite unfair to the creditors.
Yeah, and it's tough if you have to choose, on which side of the ledger gets made whole, or partially whole. I mean,
it's like forgiving student debt. Yeah. I mean, it's not quite fair to the people who paid theirs, and right. And you go into it with eyes open. I think it's very nice. I'm sure it's a great relief for people not to have the responsibility, but they did make a commitment.
Yeah. We talked a bit before the interview, and I mentioned the documentary, The Bank of Dave. And this is a guy named Dave that somewhere near Manchester, England, and he applied for a banking license. And I think it's the first time in like 150 years, and he was granted it. And he had more of a community attitude. So the interest that the bank earns, I mean, outside of paying the employees and the mortgage on the building, it goes back into the community. So they have like a higher, better food bank, better community services and that type of thing. I thought, wow, what a refreshing way to look at, the banking system. I certainly give me your comment, but I have a friend that's in Tennessee, and he's a big advocate of sound money. And I had no idea that this film even existed. He goes, "You've got to watch this." And it was right on like a Friday, so I had the weekend, so I could hardly wait to dial it up and watch it. But it really kind of warms your heart that, I'll just admit it, I've kind of had a bias over the years of all the study I've done that I'm not like the biggest advocate for the banking system as it exists now, especially dealing with some of the investment bankers in the mining industry. And I've seen sort of the greed. I've seen it. And I'm not pointing at any specific people. But anyway, I'll come back on point just to see how it's the same thing done in a different way, kind of warmed my heart. Would you like to comment?
Well, I'll make it a point to see that. I love the concept. I really do. That's like the seed corn idea, and we're all
Yeah.
going to benefit. I can spare the financial capital. You need the financial capital. You have a plan. I trust you. Go here. And I like it. I don't know if that Bank of Dave charged interest or not, but I love community banks. My husband was a banker decades ago, and I consider that a noble art. Financial intermediation is a beautiful thing to me, because think of what a community bank does. And I mean a for-profit institution, but they know their customers. They help them finance different things in their life, or those same customers when they're successful maybe now want to have deposits, and all of that feeds human endeavor. And the bank is in a position to evaluate the merits of the potential loan. Maybe it could be a hardware store is going to expand its capabilities. It could be something else. It could be well, whatever small business, especially. I think that's blessed. Small business people, they should be able to have access to capital, but not automatically. I mean, they should be able to have a banking relationship and get an honest evaluation of their project. And if it seems to hold up, then I like to think that they are deemed worthy. And again, a profit motive. One thing great about capitalism is, Adam Smith taught us this, that by seeking your own well-being, you're helping others. The invisible hand, you do well by doing good. And so I think the whole system has to cater to individuals as people and anticipate their needs and try to do it better than what's available. So I love that idea of a community bank. What I don't like is that big banks today, I think, are changing their business model. I mean, where do you get your mortgage today? There's so much private lending going on. I think the banks are too busy just engaging with the Fed, trading claims to government securities. And it starts with, they can leave cash sitting in their master account at the Fed, doing nothing to provide real capital to the real economy. And they get paid today 4.65% on cash, doing nothing. They don't have to hire a loan officer. They just let it sit there. And that, to me, even helps explain why we're seeing the longer term rates go up. Because if I think the Fed's going to keep rates high, and after they cut suddenly in September, and then again at the last meeting, and now they're thinking, suddenly now they're worried about fiscal implications or tariffs or whatever it is. But post-election, now Chair Powell is sending signs that, well, maybe we'll keep rates high. If I'm a bank, I'm thinking, why should I buy a 3-month Treasury bill or a 5-year note or a 10-year bond if I can get this much on a cash account? And so as you reduce the demand for those other Treasury instruments, it's all an array of government guaranteed interest generating, quote, investments. Why not stick with the cash one that gives you all the options? And so I think that explains, as you have less demand for those longer term Treasury securities, which a bank should be indifferent between keeping it at the Fed or investing in a U.S. Treasury security. It's all U.S. government payment of interest. So I think as the demand flows out, then the rate has to go up. because the rate on those longer term treasuries is just determined by supply and demand. So I think that helps explain why the Fed can have higher short-term rates, meaning the one they dictate, the administered rate, what they pay on reserves held by banks, and then that explains why long-term treasuries can go up or down. But I think it's this assessment by banks on, it's a mechanical effect, in other words.
And it's the use of capital. I mean, I won't repeat what you said. You said it very well, but it goes kind of back to the idea of usury. You said, well, if you're taking a risk and you're foregoing consumption now for better in the future, and sorry, I got to digress a bit. You said something I really love to repeat, and that is the paradox of capitalism. And it's a paradox because I can serve myself and serve others at the same time. And that is a paradox because we think you can't have both, but you can. But coming back on point, if you're going to put up delayed consumption, does it have to be interest on the loan? Could it be a part owner in the hardware store, for example? And I think that's kind of what the Islamic banking system reportedly does. And I've been thinking about this a lot. I mean, I want what's fair and right for everybody. I think sound money principles apply to the poorest of the poor and the richest of the rich. And if you use the non-usury idea, purportedly come out with, you don't have these huge displacements where a very small percentage of the population owns a great deal of the Earth's wealth, however you measure it. I think it's time to get back on track. I think your proposal is very worthwhile in understanding. I just fear that we may be facing a liquidity squeeze at some point. And if that is the case, I'll bring up the Exter pyramid. Are you familiar with that at all? John Exter.
Wait, I want to go back to what you were saying about Islamic banking, because
Sure.
I mean, you of course you could say I'll loan you the money, but let's do an equity deal,
right,
instead of a loan. I mean, that's a bank loan is like a bond. I'm going to get this piece of the distribution of returns. I'm guaranteed this left tail. But if I take equity, then I have maybe unlimited upside, or it just depends. So I think a person should have an option depending on their own level of risk aversion. And some people would settle for the bond because for sure they're promised, and especially a government bond, riskless, guaranteed. Whereas if you're more open to equity, that's fine. That means you might end up with nothing if it goes bust. So that's okay. But in Islamic banking, yes, the usury laws are there, but I always thought it was kind of a bit of a machination to the way I think it's just the way they set up the contract.
Right.
That it's this amount you're putting in, and then this amount we're getting back. So I don't know if that's a way to get around. Well, it is a way to get around usury laws, but I think it ends up being the same as an interest-bearing loan.
Right. And you just brought up the idea of convertible debenture because and most of our audience will know what we're talking about, but you have both equity and an interest rate, and you get to decide. And usually when you put out something that's convertible where you get to choose between an interest rate or equity, you get to loan at a lower rate because you have the upside of the equity portion. But
I think, again, choice. I think investors, if you give them an array of choices and then they decide what makes sense for them, depending on the reward and the risk factor and their own, as Milton famously talked about, risk aversion for individuals, which can change throughout your lifetime too.
Sure. Yeah. So circling back a little bit to, the hardware store idea and the community bank, do you think that we would have a different position in our financial place right now if Glass-Steagall hadn't been nixed under the Clinton administration? I mean, at that time, the Glass-Steagall idea was you had merchant banks, what I call merchant banks, which is your loans for what I call hard loans, for farms, for mortgages, for something you could go put your hands on, an auto dealership or whatever. And then you had your investment banks, and there was a great separation between the two. If you wanted to gamble or take a higher risk, then you went to an investment bank. But if you just wanted to, help your community out by putting your savings into the bank so a farm could be improved or a mortgage could be made, there was a separation. But when they all became investment banks, more or less, it seems like there was more risk put in the system. Have you ever thought about that?
Well, I think it's an interesting concept to bring up, because having that wall does kind of highlight what we were talking about, sort of community banking, real projects. We'll call that the real economy. But when you're talking about investment activity, or you might say proprietary investment on the part of the bank, this for me is an issue. It goes to the heart of the increasing financialization of gross domestic product. I mean, you have people making money, pure financial arbitrage. You have over the notional value of outstanding derivatives that the Bank for International Settlements would lay out those statistics. These are unbelievable numbers, like 600 trillion. I mean, there are maybe 80 times gross domestic product for the whole world. And then they collapse down as these options reach the date of maturity. They collapse down, but right up to the last minute, anything could happen. And that's part of the value of, in a Black-Scholes sense, of option pricing model, the fact that anything could happen right up until the instrument runs out. And it's that financialization. It pays people. You can make tons of money doing that, just like currency, the foreign exchange markets. I mean, that's what, 8 trillion a day, daily turnover, the volume. And what is that really accomplishing? You're just trading money. The money itself is the investment. It's not going to anything. It just is retailoring or reconfiguring. And sometimes it's just for its own sake. It's like having puts and calls that are uncovered. I mean, you're just playing the financial angle of gaming. I know a lot of people would say, well, that's a wonderful thing. I want to do that. It's just, if it's the fallout from not having a coherent, rational international monetary system, and it's the fallout from having people able to make money by gaming what the European Central Bank is going to do relative to the Federal Reserve or the Bank of Japan. We saw this carry trade with the Bank of Japan. We could go there again, where if you can borrow for zero in that currency, and then you invest it in, say, Mexico or in the US, and then depending on what happens with the exchange rate, I mean, it's just a way to arbitrage these disparate inflation and interest rate paths that are being pursued by the world's major central banks. I think that rewards speculators. I don't blame them for taking advantage of a non-system, an anti-system. But I fault governments for not finding a way to have a level international monetary playing field that would not allow, it would not make it possible to arbitrage, or I would say generate empty profits. I mean, they're worth it. You can spend them, but they do nothing to generate productive new wealth in the sense of new products, new services, the kinds of things that increase genuine prosperity.
Yeah, I'm real big on talking about the difference between the physical economy and the financial economy.
Yes.
What the equity market did yesterday. I've got one more. You've been very generous with your time. It's been fascinating to talk to you. Thank you. The last one I have is back here. It's actually a VHS tape. That's how long it goes, but it's the $1 trillion bet. And the idea that, long-term capital management had this, Black-Scholes model. I mean, it's some Nobel laureates, right? And they came out with a math model that was—
One was on the board of long-term capital management.
Yeah. So we sit there and we look, and this is what my summation is, and certainly you got a different opinion. I want to hear it. But I would say you cannot predict human behavior. Now, in that model, you could predict human behavior maybe 99% of the time, but not 100% of the time. And that's my point. So in that $1 trillion bet, when they got on the wrong side of the ruble, it took out the whole thing. And as you know, there was a quick meeting with the Fed to paper over this mistake. So I give you that lead in to say this. I'm concerned about all the algorithm trading. I'm concerned about the financialization. I'm concerned about the distortion of what money really is and what its purpose is. I'm concerned that we're in a situation that we may not get out of. I'm not concerned about me. I've got some more years left and hopefully they'll be very good ones. But I've got 2 daughters and a granddaughter. And as much as I've done in my life to try to point out the strength of an honest money system, I don't think I've failed, but I certainly don't think that voice has been heard strong enough or long enough. So I gave you a big package, but I'd like you to unravel that for me. What are your thoughts about perhaps seeing a liquidity squeeze in the future or some type of financial conundrum that we can't get out of?
Well, first off, I think your voice has been very strong. That's why I look forward to doing this interview with you. And I think you bring profound principles to the table because you take money very seriously and what it means, I think, for civilization, I might even say, and for our values. First, I would just say Alan Greenspan became very interested in behavioral finance after 2008. I've known him a long time. I first got a note from him in, I think it was 1990. He'd read my book on the coming Soviet crash. And I was, at Hoover Institution at Stanford. He said, if you're ever in DC, why don't you drop by the office? Let's talk about it. He's intellectually very curious. And so that I've known him since then and would meet regularly, both when he was chairman and afterward. He still consulted. And even through my nomination, I would email him if there was a really mean column about my qualifications. And he was always very reassuring. But could something happen? I think that the whole crypto movement and this yearning for decentralized finance is really a cri de coeur. Right? A cry from the heart that something should change. I think people are concerned about the capabilities of governments to manage money. And money is a very fundamental, very personal asset to all of us. And I think there's this desire to restore money as kind of private property. You earn it, you save it. And why should government have the ability to use it as just one more economic instrument to achieve their objectives? Right. And so if there's a way to restore the sanctity of your private property and to say the government does not have a right to expropriate it, whether it's 2% a year or 9%, which we briefly hit, I think that your strong voice is needed, and everything's timing. Everything's timing, as Milton would say. Something seems impossible until it becomes inevitable, and I think that there's a new emphasis in the United States on the need for sound finances and sound money, and I hope that what we're maybe going to do with the help of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in the fiscal sphere will also force a reexamination of the appropriate role of our central bank in our free market economy. And do we want to have a group of a dozen people meeting 8 times a year to decide what should be the cost of capital? Because that price, the price of capital, is arguably the most important price in a capitalist society. So I hope that we'll be reexamining these things. it's amazing that after 2008, thinking of your daughters and what they will face in the future, it's amazing that the institution that I think had the most responsibility for properly calibrating the amount of money and credit out there, who could claim that position more than the Federal Reserve, why wasn't it their fault? Why they said, oh, we don't think it was because of that. I mean, that's why we give them so much power. It's to prevent that. That's why we went off a gold standard, to have an elastic currency. But we didn't really talk about monetary policy until the 30s, when we nationalized it all. Before, it was just a matter of, we were still on a gold standard in 1913. And, it was a matter of, well, let's make sure there's always enough cash. Sometimes farmers are withdrawing cash from banks. Sometimes they're stuffing it into banks, depending on the harvest season. So let's accommodate that. But that turned into monetary policy being more important than money itself. And that's where we've made our mistake.
Well, it's been a true pleasure. Is there anything you'd like to say about where to get the book, your website, if you do a blog? I mean, anything you'd like to say to close out, Judy? Again, it's been, you made my week and my month. Thank you.
Oh, that's too kind. That's too kind. It's been a pleasure and an honor for me. The book's, I mean, it's on Amazon. All the royalties will go to Independent Institute. They gave me a home after my nomination didn't work out, and they've just been wonderful. But it's selling very well. It's been number one in the category of money and monetary policy. That pleases me. I am on X. That's the only social media I do, at Judy Shell, although my name's Shelton. But that's the handle, and I read everything on X all the time, so maybe too much. But I just hope other people, and you're a champion of the sound money movement. I hope we just keep demanding that it needs to work for us, or else we should be allowed to see competitive currencies. And I don't think the dollar deserves singular legal tender status and the special tax treatment of dollars compared to, say, a cyber currency, if it doesn't perform in providing those fundamental functions of money as a meaningful unit of account and dependable store of value.
Right. Very well said.
But it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, pleasure's all mine.
Well, thank you to both David and Judy for a fantastic interview that I've personally already enjoyed listening to more than once. Hope you had a good time at home watching that as well. Although before we wrap up, there was some breaking news out in the silver space ahead of the holidays, and let's take you there right now. Here is the silver chopper Ben Bernanke.
That is so cool.
Can you even see his tie flying in the wind while he throws out $100 bills? Look at him getting ready to throw that money out there.
I see that.
Because that's what it looks like when
That
Ben
even looks
Bernanke-
like his sorry ass.
Look at the size of the bald silvery head.
Yeah.
It's enormous. Back propeller spin too.
How many ounces is that?
That's 26 ounces of 3/9 fine silver, homie. As you can see here, some of the key features with your silver chopper Ben figurine, you can really get the control panel. Look, there's a whole dashboard for Ben to fly. He wants to fly onto your desk and throw $100
here,
bills
Ben.
down. Look at the precision.
I see that.
Greasy old bastard.
He's got 2 sets of spinnable propellers
This
built.
thing is great.
Dude, you could fly that thing.
Wow. I could.
Look how happy he is. I think he's actually going to get out there and throw the $100 bills. Jerome, no!
There'll be $1,000 bills by then.
I got this.
I like it.
Get the history before it's made. Well, thank you, Craig and Bill.
Janet, he's back. No.
And thank you, everyone at home watching. I would add that if you are interested in the Silver Chopper Ben, you order before Cyber Monday, coming up in just over a week. He can be there in time for Christmas or the other holidays. Again, click on the link in the description field below to find out more. And as always, I do hope you're having a wonderful weekend, and we will see you again on Monday.